From the tale of a Revolutionary War widow, who one man says still occupies a Massachusetts lighthouse, to the return of a Vermont farmer, whose last will and testament was not carried out, here is a collection of ghostly tales from the 6 states of New England. The Plymouth Light, also known as Gurnet Light, is located at Gurnet Point, Massachusetts. Unlike many lighthouses in New England, Gurnet Light is not well known for its hauntings. There is one story, however, that is tied to the historic 18th century site. In the 1760s, before the Gurnet Light existed, John and Hannah Thomas lived on the northern corner of the mouth of Plymouth Bay. Sometime during that same decade, they agreed to have a new lighthouse built on their property, on the condition that John was given the role of lightkeeper. This was agreed, and the lighthouse began operation in 1769. However, John's involvement in the running of the light was short-lived. He joined the Revolutionary War in the decade following, and all responsibilities for keeping the lighthouse functional passed over to his wife in 1776. John died of smallpox while at war, and Hannah, said to be dedicated to her post, held the role until her death 14 years later. She was the first female lighthouse keeper in the US, but she served before the inception of the Federal Lighthouse Service, so is not always officially recognised as such. When fire destroyed the lighthouse in 1801, it was rebuilt and a second tower was added. Both towers were rebuilt again in 1842, and in 1924 the northeast tower was decommissioned when it was decided that 2 lights were not needed. It was later dismantled. The remaining south tower, known now as Plymouth Light or Gurnet Light, was moved 140 feet or 43 metres to the north in 1998 after the cliff began to erode. Sometime in the 1990s, well-known lighthouse photographers Bob and Sandra Shanklin stayed the night at the old lightkeeper's dwelling. Bob Shanklin was known to be a pragmatic man and sceptical when it came to things of a paranormal nature, but during that night he awoke to see a slow-moving, glowing formation in the corner of his eye. He slowly turned his head to see the head and shoulders of a young woman, apparently floating a few inches above his sleeping wife. The apparition, according to Bob, had long parted hair and a colonial-style garment around her neck. To avoid her unnerving gaze, he glanced past her and out of the window, focusing now on the turning light of the tower as it shone through the window. After about the 5th rotation, he said he glanced back and she was gone. In 1998, when he spoke to filmmakers who were shooting a documentary for the Learning Channel entitled Haunted Lighthouses, he told them that he now refers to the apparition as My Lady, and said, "Her eyes were the saddest eyes I have ever seen. I know that it wasn't a dream. I know I was wide awake. I made a point to let myself know I wasn't dreaming." Could this apparition have been, as many have suggested, the spiritual remnants of Hannah Thomas, still suffering the loss of her husband John? Many apparitions all over the world have been given the moniker the White Lady, but few are better known than the White Lady of Union Cemetery in eastern Connecticut. The cemetery lies just off the junction of Routes 59 and 136, where it has been claimed the apparition of a woman dressed in a white gown, some say a wedding dress, has been seen drifting through the tombstones of the 400-year-old graveyard. Little more than 4 miles away, at Stepney Cemetery in Monroe, a similar spectre, some say the same one, has also been seen. Although the stories were already well known locally, famed paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were citizens of Monroe, brought the story of the White Lady of Union Cemetery to wider public attention. Subsequently, the legend became very popular and attracted a lot of tourists and ghost hunters. But it was when tombstones started being vandalised that the Eastern Police Department placed a ban on anyone entering the cemetery or even stopping in the vicinity after dusk. The two best known sightings concerning this particular phantom come from the early 1990s. According to Tony Spira, son-in-law of Lorraine Warren, who has run the Ed and Lorraine Warren YouTube channel since 2009, the following events are absolutely true. Late one night in 1990, a man named Rod, who had just finished a 4 to 12 shift at Home Depot in Bridgeport, was approaching Union Cemetery en route to Monroe in his pickup truck. The time was just before 1 AM. In what was a matter of seconds, Rod said that the ghostly figure of an elderly man appeared in the passenger seat of his truck, pointed towards the road ahead and then vanished. Immediately after this, Rod saw a woman in white standing in the road ahead with her arm outstretched, as if trying to stop the oncoming vehicle. He said he felt a rush of air as he passed through her. Shaken up by the experience and overcome with a sudden overwhelming sadness, he continued home. He said that this is when he noticed his side of the road was momentarily awash with a deep blood red. When he arrived home, he told his wife about what he had seen. The following day, Rod called Ed Warren to tell him what he had witnessed, and the following night, and every night for the next 7 days, Ed Warren travelled to Union Cemetery, where he continually videoed the graveyard and that section of Route 59. On the 7th night, Ed Warren claimed to have actually caught footage of the lady in white in the grounds of Union Cemetery, footage that, as far as I can see, has not been released. The second sighting comes from 1993, when a fireman named Glenn claims to have collided with an apparition on Route 59 during a thunderstorm. He was on his way to a fight in Stepney, Monroe, and was accompanied by an off-duty police officer who also later relayed the same version of events. A lone driver who was behind them also said that she saw the exact same thing. The collision, according to everyone involved, even resulted in physical damage to Glenn's vehicle, but the person who they thought they had run over was nowhere to be seen. Theories behind who the woman is and how she came to pass are varied. Some say she was a bride-to-be who died on the way to her wedding. Others say she was murdered shortly after killing her husband, while another tale says she died during childbirth. The story is often cited as originating in the 1940s, while others say they are sure it is the ghost of Harriet R. Seeley, who died on May 28, 1853, and whose young son died just a week before, on May 21st. So, as is typical with such urban legends, the dates, names and events surrounding its origin are at best vague. This brings me to a newspaper clipping I found from 1871. It tells the story, albeit a very short one, of a shadow of a woman seen atop a gravestone of a young boy, who, according to the article, was thrown downstairs and killed several years before by the woman who haunts his grave. The cemetery in question was in Bridgeport, 10 miles south of Union Cemetery, and is referred to only as the City Cemetery. According to the Falkirk Herald and Linlithgow Journal, who printed the story on January 19, 1871, a story which originated from the New York Times, hundreds of people reported witnessing the spectacle. Could this Bridgeport story, printed almost 150 years ago, have been the true origin of Connecticut's White Lady? Now, I should probably warn you that this next story, regardless of whether the supernatural aspect is genuine or not, is a particularly sad one. We begin in Boston in March of 1976. A young mother named Eileen Campbell had grown tired of the changing face of the city. She said that, at the time, Boston had become an unlivable, intimidating place. Both unemployment and crime were high, and it wasn't somewhere she wanted to raise her two very young children. Her husband, who remains unnamed in this story, had been searching for a new home for the family, and one day, while in eastern Maine, he believed he had found it. He called Eileen from the shore of the Denny River in the town of Dennysville to tell her the news. Eileen gathered the children, got into their 1968 Chevy, and drove to eastern Maine. The 200-year-old house, which stood on 5 acres of land, was everything the family had wished for, but as Eileen ventured up the stairs and into a small back room, the warm feeling she had felt from the rest of the house was gone. So overwhelming was the feeling that she was stopped in her tracks at the threshold. It was a north-facing room with an old chimney in the corner and a small window that overlooked the driveway. Because the couple had been so taken by the rest of the house and were on the verge of buying, Eileen tried to ignore her aversion to the cold back room. They soon purchased the house and moved in. By August of 1976 there was a new addition to the family, a baby girl they named Jacqueline. Eileen had no intention of moving any of her children into the room upstairs. She didn't even want to move them into their intended room next to it, because all that separated that room from the cold, foreboding room was a small hatch-like door, held shut by an old-fashioned rusty latch. When Eileen spoke to her husband about her unexplained fear of the room, he disregarded her concerns, saying that she had watched too much television and was letting her imagination run wild. She listened, and with a great deal of trepidation, Eileen moved the children into the room next to the cold, unfriendly space. It was then that Eileen noticed a strange reoccurrence. On some mornings she would find the latch of the door unhooked. She knew that the latch was too high for any of the children to reach, and her husband swore he hadn't touched it. But according to Eileen, this happened on most mornings. As time went by, Eileen began to find the door not only unlatched, but open, sometimes ajar, sometimes wide open. This was when the nightmares began, a reoccurring one in which Eileen found herself holding a limp child in her arms. When she looked down, she saw that it was one of her own, and knew that the child was dead. On many a night for weeks at a time, Eileen experienced the same nightmare, and every morning the small doorway would be found unlatched and open. In February of 1977, Eileen had a particularly frightening dream. It started the same way as usual, but when she looked down at the child's face it was different, undefined, as if it had been smudged. She then heard a loud voice say, "Choose." In a cold sweat, and fighting back the tears, Eileen awoke in the dead of night and simply replied, "I can't." Now convinced that the well-being of her children were being threatened by some malevolent force, she stormed into the cold back bedroom and shouted at whatever it was to leave. It was then that she saw, just for a moment, a human figure huddled in the corner of the room. It was small, black in colour, and somehow vulnerable and pathetic. As quickly as it had appeared, the apparition was gone, leaving an empty, familiar, dusty corner. After this otherworldly confrontation, the nightmare stopped completely. Eileen believed that this was because she had confronted whatever evil spirit had caused them. 1 month after the nightmares ended, the family were told that baby Jacqueline had developed meningitis. But the doctor at the Machias Hospital in Maine misdiagnosed the condition. He told the family that Jacqueline's illness was due to flu and teething, urging the family to keep her temperature down. Hours after the diagnosis, Jacqueline's temperature soared, and she began to convulse. Eileen rushed her back to the hospital, where she was airlifted to a paediatric intensive care unit in Portland, but it was too late. By the end of that day in 1977, Eileen Campbell was holding her dead child. When the devastated family eventually returned to Dennisville, Eileen entered the back bedroom. The dark, ominous feeling that once surrounded it was gone, and it felt as warm as the rest of the house. According to one Rhode Island legend, there was once a successful merchant sailor by the name of Japheth Wedderburn, who lived in a mansion on the shores of Narragansett Bay. He amassed a fortune over the years and built the mansion in 1830, but his only company was a servant named Holy Craddock, who cared for the 4-story mansion during Captain Wedderburn's long excursions at sea. On returning from sea one day, Wedderburn was not alone. He had met a young woman on his travels, married and brought her home with him. Her name was Donna Mercedes, a petite woman who is said to have often dressed in a black lace mantilla. Donna's country of origin is unclear, and has been reported as both Barbados and Spain. She was said to be unhappy in her new home. Unable to speak English, she kept herself to herself and rarely ventured out. Her new husband was due to return to sea again soon, leaving Donna to wander the mansion alone, with only Holy Craddock as company. Local residents said they often saw the young woman staring out of the window across the bay, always wearing her mantilla dress and holding a tortoiseshell comb. When Captain Wedderburn eventually returned, he was met by an inconsolable wife, who missed her family and wanted desperately to return to her homeland. Wedderburn told the people of Narragansett that he would be taking his forlorn wife with him on his next voyage and returning her to her family as she'd wished. After being at sea for 2 years, he returned, telling anyone who would ask that Donna had been reunited with her family. 2 years later, Wedderburn passed away, and it was shortly after that the people of the town began to report seeing the figure of a small woman pacing back and forth in the windows of the great mansion. Some said they recognised her as Donna Mercedes, but were confused as to why she was still in Rhode Island. Subsequent owners of the house said that they had heard the sobbing of a woman and witnessed an apparition on the 3rd floor. In 1925 the house was heavily renovated. A fireplace in the library was badly cracked and needed to be removed. When it was, a small wooden coffin was found placed behind it. When workmen pried it open, to their astonishment they found the skeleton of a woman in a tattered, rotted black lace mantilla. Placed above her skull was a tortoiseshell comb. Donna Mercedes had never made it home. How she died is still a mystery, although it's thought by many that Japheth Wedderburn had killed her, and this could be for good reason, as he was known to be an unfriendly, bad-tempered man. Another theory is that Holy Craddock had carried out the deed, out of jealousy of her boss's beautiful exotic bride. The truth went to the grave, along with the occupants of the house many years ago. Apparently so did the house itself. The building in which the events allegedly took place no longer stands. According to Thomas D'Agostino's book Haunted Rhode Island, in 2005 the remains of the old mansion could be found on Ocean Road, close to the shoreline. However, the street the house stood on has often been named as Front Street, but there is no mention of a front street in historical records, and the nearest front street now lies 40 miles north in the Rhode Island town of Lincoln. According to Volume 6 of the Historical Register of Narragansett, there was a street unofficially known to locals as Front Street in Providence as early as 1810. So in a similar vein, could Ocean Road in Narragansett have once been unofficially known as Front Street? So is this simply an imagined campfire ghost story passed down over the years with no foundation in truth, or is it from a place that has been long forgotten, rebuilt and renamed over time? Author Susan Smitten stated in her 2003 book Ghost Stories of New England that Rhode Island hypnotist John Koenig had written about the case and claimed to have found proof that the story of Donna Mercedes is true and that there had been numerous sightings of her ghost. However, Susan Smitten was unable to make contact with him for confirmation. I also tried to contact Mr. Koenig myself, with no success. A conversation between well-known ghost hunter Hans Holzer and revered New York sculptor Elizabeth Nealon Weistrop revealed a story regarding an experience she had had a few years earlier, whilst living in Cape Cod. Hans Holzer paid a visit to Elizabeth Weistrop on this day, and while he admired a medallion sculpture she was working on entitled Sower of the Forest, he listened to her story. Back in 1956, Weistrop and her family had rented a house in West Hyannisport from a woman named Mrs. Ridley. The house had previously belonged to Mrs. Ridley's elderly mother, who had recently passed away. Mrs. Ridley, her husband, and daughter Rodella lived in the house next door, and dearly missed the grandmother they fondly referred to as Gunny. During her time living next door to the Ridley family, Elizabeth was told many stories about the once energetic Gunny, and how she was always making repairs on the house that she was so proud of. One sunny afternoon, Elizabeth told Hans Holzer she had been working on a sculpture of St. Francis, She was alone in the house at the time. Her husband Harry was away that day, and her 2 daughters were at school. While deep in concentration, she heard a loud thudding coming from their daughter's bedroom. It was a well-lit room with a large window. Elizabeth thought that an item of furniture had collapsed or been overturned, but when she went to investigate, nothing in the room had been moved. Puzzled at the unexplained disturbance, she moved to the window. Seeing no sign of anyone, Elizabeth then moved to the next room, which was the kitchen, passing by the family dog that was fast asleep. She said that it was odd that the usually nervous dog was completely undisturbed by the loud noise. She noted the time on the kitchen clock as 2:30, which gave her half an hour to continue work on her sculpture before her husband would return, closely followed by their daughters. That evening, when the girls were in their beds, Elizabeth walked outside to the backyard of the house. She saw Mrs. Ridley sat on the porch of her house opposite. They greeted one another, and her neighbour invited her in for coffee. While they sat around a table, accompanied by her daughter and her daughter's fiancé, Mrs. Ridley told Elizabeth of an experience she had had that day. The Ridleys were a family who openly claimed to have had a number of paranormal experiences over the years. Maybe it was for this reason that Mrs. Ridley, quite matter-of-factly, told Elizabeth that earlier that day, while sat in the kitchen, she saw, out of the window, her dead mother walking up the path, leading from the woods to Weinstrop's house. She said that she watched as her mother slowly made her way to the girl's bedroom, which Elizabeth now knew to be Gunny's former bedroom, knocked on the window and then disappeared. When Elizabeth asked what time this had happened, Mrs. Ridley, apparently undisturbed by the experience, said, "It was around 2:30. This next strange occurrence allegedly happened in the town of Pownall, situated in the southwestern corner of Vermont, close to the New York and Massachusetts borders. Back in 2000, a man named Scott Bump and his fiancée April sat in their home on Palmer Drive on Halloween night, awaiting a knock on the door from trick-or-treaters. When the first knock came, April excitedly jumped to her feet and ran to the door. She returned with a smile, happy that the local children had chosen their house. As she sat down next to Scott, she noticed the expression on his face had changed. He had a look of shock and confusion, and when asked what was wrong, he nervously told April that he didn't want to panic her, but he had just seen a man, dressed in old clothing, appear from the bedroom across the hall and then vanish. But he didn't appear from the doorway, Scott said. It was as if he had passed through the wall. He said the man wore a reddish flannel shirt and old farm-style boots. Now this wasn't the first unexplained experience Scott had ever had. Years ago, shortly after his father's death, he had seen him. He had kept the experience from April for years. He felt foolish and was sure she wouldn't believe him. But here, in the comfort of their own home, on Halloween night of all nights, he had had such an experience again. April said later that she had a suspicion about who the spectre was, but kept it to herself until a few days later, when the couple paid April's mum and dad a visit. There they flicked through photos of April's family, when suddenly Scott exclaimed that a man in one of the photos was the man he'd seen on Halloween night. It was Edgar Rathbun, April's great-grandfather, who had built the house in 1950 with the help of his grandson, April's father. Edgar Rathbun owned another property nearby, which was once a farmhouse. One day in the grounds surrounding this farmhouse, Rathbun was badly injured when he was kicked by one of his cows. Refusing to see a doctor and paying for treatment, the wound became infected, and Rathbun died of gangrene poisoning. He had told his wife that if he were to die before her, he wanted to be buried in the grounds of the farmhouse, and was very specific about who his belongings should go to. For some reason these wishes were ignored. His estate was not shared as he'd specified, and his wife purchased ground for his burial in Pownall Cemetery. In 2000, the layout of the house Edgar Rathbun had built in 1950 was different to how it used to be. For example, the doorway of the bedroom had been moved. Explaining to April and Scott why the apparition of her great-grandfather was seen coming through the wall at a point where the old doorway used to be. It transpired, after Scott had told April's parents about what he had seen, that April's father had also seen his grandfather while chopping wood in the cellar of the same house. The family firmly believed that the ghost of Edgar Rathbun had not left out of frustration that his will had been ignored, and he now occasionally roamed the house that he had worked so hard to build. When restaurateur Joanna Oliver heard that the Tilton Inn in New Hampshire was due for demolition to make way for a parking lot, she thought it would be a shame to see such a beautiful historic building swept aside. In 2001 she purchased and reinvented it as the 1875 Inn, although it's still also known by its original name. Joanna was just days away from opening her new hotel as she painted flowers on the doorframe of a room in one of the upper floors. It was then that she was approached by a very elderly woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Giles. The stranger said that she had something for the new owner and handed Joanna a photograph. The accounts of this meeting vary slightly with each retelling of the story, but generally Mrs. Giles explained that the girl in the tattered old photograph was named Laura. She was 12 years old when she died in a fire in that very building, and according to Mrs. Giles, she was still there. Following her brush with the mysterious lady, whom she has not seen since, Joanna says that strange things began to happen at the inn once it had opened. The NASCAR races, held at the New Hampshire Motor Speedway in Loudon, is an important event in the calendar for innkeepers, as it brings a great deal of custom. It was the weekend of the first NASCAR event that took place following the opening of the hotel. Joanna says that during that weekend, a woman still completely wet and covered in nothing but a towel ran from her room on the upper floor to the hotel lobby, where she began shouting at the staff, asking why they had allowed a teenage girl to run around her bedroom while she was having a shower. One regular visitor to the hotel was a biker who, on first entering his room, which is known as the Sanborn Room, was met with a young girl sat on his bed. When spoken to, she did not respond, so the man returned to reception and explained that his room had already been taken. By now, having her suspicions as to who the girl was, Joanna went to investigate. No one was in the room, but there was a clear indentation on the bed, as if someone had already sat there. Brendan Smith, who was then the assistant editor of the Weir's Times newspaper, also said that he had found his bed suddenly disturbed or unmade in the same room. The Sanborn Room, named after New Hampshire author, journalist and politician Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, is the most common location for sightings of Laura, and is thought to be the room she died in. The Tilton Inn has been a haven for ghost hunters, and many vigils have taken place there over the years. These vigils have produced a number of photographs of claimed anomalies and spectral beings. The story behind Laura's death varies slightly from source to source, but according to David J. Pitkin's 2010 book New England Ghosts, the 12-year-old, being the mature and trustworthy girl her parents knew her to be, was left in charge of the inn while they were away on business. This was sometime in the late 19th century. A fire which began in a neighbouring building spread to the Tilton Inn. It said that Laura was trapped in the room known now as Sanborn Room and perished there. Another fire occurred in 1903, but it was the earlier fire that is said to have killed Laura. The photograph of Laura, handed to Joanna Oliver in 2001, was reproduced to a much larger scale, and now adorns the wall of the hotel lobby.